Yeah, so as the 2NR, you have to close all of the doors before the 2AR gets a chance to even open all of those doors. As the 1AR, you have a 5-minute speech to respond to 13 minutes of argumentation, which is obviously quite tough, right? You have to be very particular and careful about what you are responding to, how you are responding to those things. And you got to be really smart about it. You have to be really smart about it. Like the worst 1ARs are the ones that stand up and just kind of like blanket extend everything just really shallowly and really short and just kind of like hope the 2AR can figure it out. It's absolutely not what you should be doing. So when you're giving the 1AR, you want to have two ideas in mind. Or two central goals, I guess is how I should say this. Number one is you want to make the 2NR's life hell. You want to make the 2NR's life hell. I think actually that is the first goal because your job as a 1A, so like your 2A, they're giving the last speech. They're probably just going to lie and cheat anyways. So it's like, whatever, you don't really need to worry about them that much. Like you should worry about them, obviously, but not all that much. Instead, your goal should be to make the 2NR's life difficult. So in the 1AR, you obviously want to start setting things up for the 2AR, but you also want to kind of keep in mind, how can I make either waste a bunch of the 2NR's time or add a bunch of depth to arguments that the 2NR is not ready to really spend a lot of time on. And that will really, really make a difference between giving a really good 1AR and giving just like an okay-ish 1AR. So that's the first thing you want to think about is you want to make the 2NR's life hell. The second thing you want to think about is make the 2AR's life easy. And we'll kind of talk about how I think you can do that as we go throughout this. One other thing that I really want to emphasize, though, is that you need to have what I like to call a killer instinct. Which is just a way of saying that you need to be able to trust yourself that you've made the argument and just move on. Trust yourself that you made the argument and just move on. So many times I see 1As either stutter or pause or just take a moment to kind of like reflect on what they've said in the speech thus far. No, you do not have time for that. That is true, by the way, I think of all speeches, but it's especially true of the 1AR because of how time pressured it is. This is very true on case debating in particular, right? People love to spend so much time on case. And don't get me wrong, like you should be spending time on case, obviously. You want to have depth of your arguments, but you also don't want to spend so much time there that you get to like the disad with 35 seconds or something like that. Right? So the way I always kind of think about it is like, boom, I said the thing, done, next. Boom, I said the thing, done, next. Boom, I said the thing, done, next, right? Like there's no downtime between your arguments. Okay, so you need to trust yourself. You really, really need to trust yourself. And part of this killer instinct then for trusting yourself is that you want to be really strategic. You want to be really strategic. So do not extend everything. Do not extend everything. Do not extend everything in the 1AR. Victoria, what should you not do in the 1AR? Yes, do not extend everything. Okay, your 2AC or your 2A maybe made 7 arguments on the DA. You should be extending 2, maybe 3 of those. Right, so you have to start collapsing down. Recognize what parts you're winning and what parts you're losing. Right, the beautiful thing about debating against an off-case argument is that you only have to win one thing to take out that entire argument, right? If you win that the disadvantage is non-unique, then who cares if the affirmative also, I don't know, it forces Russia and China into an alliance. They're already in an alliance. The Afghan doesn't make that worse, right? Or if you win, there's no impact, right? Just like, who cares? Russia-China alliance doesn't destabilize the global order or cause war or anything like that. And who cares if the plan forces them into that alliance, right? So you have the capability to be strategic and smart about what arguments you want to go for. So do it, right? Stop trying to extend everything. That is the worst 1AR. So instead, pick a few arguments and add depth to them. Add depth to them. Right? So you want to actually explain things. Dear God, please actually explain your arguments. I am definitely of the camp of the belief as a judge that if you have not introduced an argument, the other side does not need to answer it. So just because you've like breathed the words no impact to economic decline, but you haven't explained that argument to me, I don't care if the 2NR drops it. That's not an argument. Right? Which means you have to actually explain your arguments. And the 1AR should be reading new cards on the pieces that matter. Read new cards on the pieces that matter. So both the affirmative and the negative have kind of asymmetric imbalances that benefit one side over the other. So the affirmative gets to speak first and last, right? There are a whole bunch of psychological studies that say people remember the first thing and the last thing that they hear the most. And it's also true that for all that we, say, no new 2AR arguments, protect the 2NR, et cetera, those kinds of things, a lot of judges just let the 2ARs do whatever they want. So the AF has that as a huge strategic advantage for the affirmative, right? In response, the negative has the block, right? That 13-minute of argumentation. So the negative, their advantage is their ability to pick one or two arguments and just outcard the hell out of the affirmative, right? It's just be able to say like, okay, you read one card on this in the 2AC, I will read 4 new cards that answer in the 2AC. So the 1AR should be reading new cards to try and get back against that strategic imbalance. And the 1AR can do that, actually can read new cards if it is picking particular arguments and being smart and strategic about what it is going for, instead of trying to explain or instead of trying to extend everything really quickly and not having any depth. Right, so be strategic, have some depth, explain, read some new cards. Effective partner communication is absolutely crucial. And by that, I mean, the 2A is in charge of the affirmative ship, right? You should not be extending arguments that they have no intention of ever going for, right? That's part of this being strategic thing. We're not just going to extend things that can't ever possibly be in the 2AR, right? So you all should be talking about what arguments your partner wants to go for in their final speech. And this communication then is important both in round and out of round. Both in round and out of round. So you should know what your 1AR is going to be going for against most positions before the debate even begins. You should know what arguments will be in your 1AR before the debate even begins. Because you and your partner have talked about it. You all have figured it out. So as a personal example, my last year of debate was a domestic topic, which obviously means that the state's counterplan was very common. We were only ever going to go for theory against the state's counterplan. Just like, no questions about it. We were only ever going to go for theory. So like we had this conversation. We talked about arguments that we thought were persuasive about why the state's counterplan should be rejected, was theoretically illegitimate. We talked about arguments against that, what arguments we thought we were likely going to need to answer. And so like the debate would begin, the 1NC would be happening, right? And the 1N would be reading the state's counterplan. And while they're reading the state's counterplan, I would pull up my 1AR extension of state's theory and basically have it ready to go. Because my partner and I had communicated out of round so effectively that we didn't need to waste any 1AR prep time or any kind of in-round communication talking about what we were going to do against the state's counterplan. So effective partner communication is crucial to knowing how you can be strategic and where you need to have depth in order to make the 2NR's life hell and in order to make the 2AR's life a little bit easier. Okay, are there any questions so far? Let me rephrase that. Somebody asked me a question. Yeah.
Like, how would you do the 1AR against like a critique in the 2NC where they read like a bunch of framework decides? Do you have to go and like answer all of those, or is there a faster way?
You should go through and answer all of those. You should be able to explain your answer to framework so effectively that it also does help answer those framework decides. But I mean, it kind of depends on the critique itself, right? So if it's like a fiat criticism, then yes, like that's where the debate is about framework, right? But if it's like a security K, where their framework argument is like epistemology comes first, or like the research practices or a prior question or something like that, then I think you should be able to answer all of that by saying like, look, we'll just win our ACK is a good idea. Therefore, we have proven that our research practice is a good idea, or that our epistemology is a good idea. So everything else that we'll say in the speech actually answers the framework argument anyways. Yeah, that's a tough one. It is very contextual. Hallie.
Ideally, how much prep time should the 1AR take?
So we're going to talk about this a little bit more later on, but I think the answer is very little. It is an epidemic that people take so much 1AR prep time, and it's just like, I think it's silly. I think you should try and not take very much. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about just some top level things to consider when giving the 1AR. I want to talk now about actually giving the 1AR, like when you're literally giving the speech. And the first thing that I would recommend strongly is no overviews. Stop it. No overviews. Bad. Stop it. Stop it. Your overviews are bad for debate. Problem one is you're going to have to answer whatever the thing is on the line by line. Right? So if you're like, here's my impact overview on my advantage, and then 2NC number 5 is no impact to the advantage, like you're going to have to go and re-explain it there. So you're just doing double duty. You're literally just wasting time, but you do not have time to waste in the 1AR. So it is quite literally a waste of time to give an overview. So that's problem one. Problem two is that your overview is generic. right? It doesn't answer the argument that the negative has advanced, which means it is less persuasive because it is less specific to what the negative has said. Like a lost art in debate nowadays is being specific and contextualizing our arguments to what the other team has said, which is absurd to me. You want to be specific. You want to make things about what the other team has said. Because that's how persuasion works. Right? So stop with your case overviews. They're bad. They're just bad. So no overviews. Second, and this is kind of very related to no overviews, is you want to follow 2AC order. You want to follow the 2AC order because the 2AC has set the order for how the debate works, or for the flow. Right. So if 2AC1 on the DA is non-unique, then 1AR1 on the DA is non-unique. Unless you're answering their awful overview where they can without context explain their impact. The first thing should be, 2AC1 is such and such, or 2AC2 is such and such, wherever you're starting. This is also true when you're debating really messy teams. So it oftentimes occurs that when you're debating a one-off team, they will not follow 2AC order. You should still follow 2AC order in the 1AR, even if the neg has kind of mucked that up. Your judge will appreciate it. And your job in the 1AR is to reimpose order on the fly. It's also a really good ethos moment, right? Of just like, it demonstrates that you're in control, right? If the block hasn't followed the 2AC order, but the 1AR still follows 2AC order and still line by lines correctly, answers everything that the negative has said that you need to answer, then it demonstrates that you're in control of the debate. So it should bump up your points. While you're giving your speech, you should be thinking about your judge. And I kind of mean this in a couple of different ways. So number one, a lot of us will have, oh my God, I just forgot the word. What am I trying to say? Reactions. We'll have reactions to what you're saying, right? So some of us will furrow our brows. Some of us will kind of do this little thing like we're thinking. Some people will literally just shake their heads or be like, yep, or shake their heads like this. Like you should pay attention to that. Because it means, whether it's voluntary or involuntary, we are communicating something about what we think about your argument to you. You should also think about how the judge thinks. And I think the 1AR is the moment where this really starts to matter in thinking about how the judge thinks. Because it's the kind of pivot moment in the debate. I think it determines how the rest of the round is going to go. So for example, if your judge is someone who is going to read all of the cards after the debate, then you sure as hell better be out carding the block, right? But if your judge is not someone who's going to read all the cards after the debate, is going to just evaluate their flow and go from there, then you still want to read some cards, but you maybe don't need to read all of them. And think about how your judge decides debates. So when I decide debates, the first question I will always decide is, who solved what? Right? So does the affirmative solve its own impacts? Is there a counter plan or a K alternative that solves the asked impacts and or its own impacts, some kind of net benefit? Right? So think about how they're thinking. Try and put yourself in their shoes. So when you're actually extending things, Here. This is a pretty good rule of thumb for extending arguments in all speeches. But I emphasize it here because a lot of 1As do not like to follow this model because they're worried that it takes too much time, which is, as I hope to have demonstrated at this point, very silly and a really bad way to approach the 1AR. But when you're extending arguments, you want to tell us your claim, your warrant, that's X is just citing a piece of evidence. By the way, notice how we're citing evidence third. It is not the first thing that we're doing, right? So we should not be saying extend across my Lepp piece of evidence, right? That's the third thing, not the first thing. Do y'all know why it's not the first thing? Yeah. Yep. The judge is going to be writing down the first thing that you're saying. Right. And you want them to write down your claim as opposed to just the author. Right. So claim, warrant, that's X, and then actually responding to what they have said. So they said such and such, but here's our response to it. Evidence comparison. So tell us why your evidence is better than their evidence. And then 2X plus 1 is a model for the amount of new cards to read, where X is the amount of cards that the other team has read. This is very tough to follow in the 1AR because oftentimes the block will have read like 3 new cards in response to something. So this would suggest that you read like 7 new cards in response, which is like pretty tough. So I don't really expect you all to read 7 new cards in response to one particular position. But if they've read 3 cards, you should probably have at least 2 or 3 new cards. And then you just kind of rinse and repeat throughout your entire speech. You should also keep in mind the things that you must answer. Must answers, which are things if you drop them, like pretty much game over. And I don't mean this in the sense of like you all obviously know you can't like drop T or like a TA or a piece of offense, like duh. But you absolutely need to answer DA turns case. You absolutely need to answer DA turns case in the 1AR. Do you all know why you have to answer DA turns case in the 1AR? Any ideas, Gio? Yeah, if the DA turns the case, then the app can't solve anymore. Right? So let's say that like your strategy against a disadvantage is a non-unique, right? You're just like the Dems are going to win the midterms no matter what, right? But you drop that Dems winning the midterms mean that cyber gets gutted. Then like you should lose on presumption, right? Because it would be totally taking out the app. So you have to answer DA turns the case. And you do have to answer frame on the connect. Now, as Liam did ask already, how we go about doing this can be particular to your affirmative and or the critique itself. So, for example, I gave the security K example earlier. If you're debating the tech K and they've made a framework argument that's like, we have to interrogate our relationship to technology before we evaluate the merits of the plan or something like that. and you're just like, yeah, well, our 1AC says technology is good. So we think that voting at, like, we have interrogated our relationship to technology. We've decided it's a good thing. So we're just going to go for the impact turn. You can be like, our impact turn proves our answer to framework, or like our impact turn proves that we have a good relationship with technology or something like that. But you got to have something in response, because that's the easiest way for a judge to check out for a critique. It's just like, well, you dropped framework. I have to interrogate my relationship to technology before I evaluate the 1AC. So I voted neg. I think it's silly and lazy, but it's a very easy way for someone to make a decision. So don't drop DA turns case. Don't drop framework. Someone asked me a question so far about giving the 1AR. Yeah, Liam.
So like, what parts of the 1AR should be blocked out?
That is actually the next part of this lecture. So we can just go ahead and move ahead. Actually, does someone else have another question about this that's different? Okay, well then we'll just move ahead to prepping the 1AR / tips and tricks. So ways to kind of approach thinking about the 1AR, which is my first one. And I think if you all take anything away from this lecture, I really hope it's this. Well, I hope it's no overviews, but I also hope it's this, which is write 1AR blocks. Write 1AR blocks. It should be analytical and carded. Like, you should be sending out a card document for your 1AR, not your 2A. Right? It's a really common thing where the 2A will be like, oh, I'll send out the card document or something like that. I think that's a bad move, because twofold. One, it shows that your 1AR is not organized, right? It means that you don't really know where you're going to read the cards. You're just going to stand up and do it wherever your 2A has told you to. Oh my God, what was my second thing I was going to say? That might have actually just been the same thing. I was going to say it twice. Right, so you should have the cards in your 1AR blocks. And what's really great about writing 1AR blocks, having your analytics and your cards figured out, is that you can then basically have your 1AR prepared before the debate begins. And just throughout the debate, you're then editing your blocks to make it sound like, to make it more particular and specific to the other team that you're debating. Right, so like, the only thing that my partner and I ever did during, so during the 2NC or the 1NR, what I would be doing is reading the next cards on the relevant pieces that I knew were going to matter. So if they were extending the oil disadvantage, we were always going to go for this no link argument. We had such good cards on just like our carbon tax app does not link to the oil disadvantage. Right. So what I was doing during the 2NC was reading through their cards, figuring out what they thought the link argument was, and writing out my evidence index. Right. Writing out my explanation of why the judge should prefer our evidence over their evidence. Right, so that let us know, well, that let us, first of all, not use very much 1AR prep time, which I'll ramble about in a moment. But it also let us know how we needed to pivot. Right, so the rare occasion where we would debate someone on, and this honestly didn't actually happen to us, but like maybe you're in a situation where, you know, you're like, oh, I am going to go for theory against the state's counterplan, or that was the plan, but they've introduced an argument that my partner and I were just like, we got nothing on it. We really think this argument's true. Actually, we're somehow now totally convinced the state's counterplan's legitimate. We got to go for something else. If you've got your 1AR blocks written out beforehand and you're thinking about what strategies you want to go for as the debate progresses, then you have the ability to pivot much more easily. Another way to think about this is that a lot of times 1AR prep is very reactionary. It's very reactionary is usually how people do it, right? Like the block will end, you and your partner will sit there and you'll go, okay, what do we want to go for against this position this time? Your 2A will be like, well, they didn't really answer this argument very well, so I think we should go for this argument. I think that's a bad way of doing prep. It's a bad way of doing prep, period, of just like being reactionary. You instead want to be proactive. You want to be on top of it. You should be able to control, you should be able to go for the thing you want to go for, no matter how many arguments they've made against it. Right? That's part of controlling the debate. That's part of controlling the narrative. That's part of being good. It's part of being persuasive. And writing 1AR blocks lets you do that because you don't have to waste time in the debate writing out your extension of what the 2AC has said on the thing that you're going for. Also remember, you should not be going for everything in the 1AR. You want to be collapsing down, which means doing 1AR blocks is easier than you think it is. You don't need to write a 1AR extension with 2 or 3 new cards for all 7 things that the 2AC has said against the DA. You need to do that for like 2 or 3 things. And you and your partner just need to have conversations. It's like, I think this is the strongest argument against this disadvantage. This is what we're going. So I think you should write 1AR blocks. This is going to sound a little bit contradictory to what I just said, which is that I think you should write a lot of them. But when I say a lot of them, I don't mean that you need to have a block for all 7 args the 2AC says, but there's like a lot of different counterplans on this topic, right? You should have 1AR extensions of arguments that the 2AC has made against all of those possible counterplans. So my last year of debate, my 1AR block file with just 1AR blocks for our policy affirmative was 125 pages. Right, so this wasn't just like a 10-page thing where it was like, oh, we got this one argument, we're ready to go on this. Like, no, we sat there and we talked about, okay, this team wants to go for this argument. What do we think we should be saying against this? Oh, this team broke this new counter plan. This is weird. Let's talk about this. Let's figure out what our strategy is going to be. So much 1AR prep happens before the debate happens. Right, so write a lot of 1AR blocks. Style was, 125 pages. What's that one in a second? I think you should prep theory blocks too. I don't know. I'm one of the few judges in debate who thinks that theory arguments are pretty persuasive. I'm very negative leaning on conditionality, but I'm relatively affirmative leaning on particular counterplan theories. So I don't know, maybe take this one with a bit of a grain of salt, but I don't know. I think theory is a strategy. I think it's the thing that people should be going for. I think it's the thing that we don't go for enough, and we just let neg teams get away with fiating whatever they want to. And so I think you should prep theory blocks for the purpose of like, hey, this should be a strategy. Like it should be a thing that you get to go for. But you should also have it because theory is such a good time waster. If you spend 15 seconds on theory against the state's counterplan in the 1AR, like that 2NR is about to spend 45 seconds on it in the 2NR, or they're just going to fold. It's very tough for 2Ns to see through 1A smoke and mirrors on theory in particular. So I think you should have some short versions and some long versions. The exception to this, though, is conditionality. So, like, if you want to extend Kondo in the 1AR, I think just the long version makes sense. 10, 15 seconds on condo will never win you a debate in any instance. So I don't think that's really worthwhile. And any 2N worth their salt will be like, well, you spent 10 seconds on condo, like F off. I don't even really need to answer this. But if you spend like 10 or 15 seconds on states theory, consult theory, oh my God, international actor fiat, like whatever, God, there's so many counterpoints on this topic. You spend 10 to 15 seconds on that in the 1AR, the 2N's head's going to explode. Right. So I think it's worthwhile for theory against particular counterplans or particular advocacies to have that ready. I don't really think condos, if you want to extend condo in the 1AR, you've got to extend condo. Is what I'm trying to say. Impact defense is also a great thing for your 1AR blocks. It doesn't change a lot from debate to debate. It does change a little, but not a lot. Like everyone reads pretty much the same impact cards. So that's a really easy thing to block out really effectively. It also doubles as negative prep for you, right? So your no Russia war impact defense argument could be both a 1AR block and a 2NC block. I always had impact defense in a separate file. I don't really know why. It just made more sense to me. So I didn't have it as like part of my 1AR file itself, but you should also write those blocks. Okay, does that help a little bit, I guess, with your question in particular? Does anyone have other questions about 1AR blocks?
Like, should we offer case extensions in the 1AR? How should we write?
I think you should have blocks for the case as well. Usually they're going to be a little bit shorter. And you want to, like, you approach them the same way as you approach all of your other blocks, right? Like you want to have your extension of your argument. You want to be able to answer whatever it is that they're saying. You want to be able to indict their evidence. You don't want to read new cards for a case in the 1AR unless it's against an offensive argument, or you're just like, we got no cards that answer this thing. Like we're screwed if I don't read a new card. But generally, not new cards. I guess that would be the one exception to saying that it's basically the same thing.
Only office positions, you have a 2AC argument to write an exception. Should you just like predict like all the arguments you think they'll read?
Yep. Yeah. And it's like you can predict them pretty well. Like the flip side of you wanting to have impact defense against their arguments is that you need to have an impact extension of your arguments, for example. Yeah.
How specific would you be in writing 1AR blocks? So if they were going for a process counterplan, ICJ counterplan, would you go AT ICJ counterplan, like solvency deficit? ICJ counterplan doesn't talk the app, the bench, whatever it is. Or would you go more specific? Would you have one block for each counterplan, or would you go a little bit more specific? You have solvency deficit theory, solvency deficits theory, like it doesn't link the net benefit. Would you go in that much depth, or just kind of a little bit for each counterplan?
I would go with the latter. So more depth over less depth. So like the oil disad example that I had before, what we would have like, no, that's not a really good example. Like T is a pretty easy example because you're probably going to need to extend a couple different arguments, right? So you probably have your 1AR, here's our we meet argument, here's our 1AR counter interpretation argument, our 1AR over limiting argument, our 1AR reasonability argument. Does that make sense? Okay. Okay, last thing I want to talk about, oh, I'm sorry, Ria. Right, Ria, right? You're in, no, you're, no, sorry, one more time. That's right. You were both in my lab at Georgetown. That's how okay, cool. That's a good cue. I think that you should debate as much of it off the flow as you can. So the way I always kind of thought about it is Your blocks are the things that you've written before the debate and your, how you've edited them based on what they've said. And then the flow is a really good place for evidence indicts and comparison, right? So one of the things that debaters will do as we get more advanced is we're not trying to flow everything that the other team has said. We're instead flowing particular things that will help us. So I would basically flow, like I would flow whatever the central argument was they get. And then instead of flowing tags, I started just flowing authors because I was like, oh, I know, like I need to read this card. And so I need to have a marking down of this is the card they've read. And then I would just write next to that why that evidence was unqualified. That's a good key though. I mean, debating off your flow is an incredibly important skill because like there are going to be times where you're off your blocks. Like they break a new counter plan or something weird happens. And so you want to be able to cultivate that skill as best as you can. So it is a tough balance to strike. Okay, we've only got a few more minutes. I want to talk a little bit about 1AR prep time. As I've already said, you don't want to use a lot of 1AR prep time. I think I would aim for, I guess it depends on how much prep you all get. So like if you all have like 8 minutes of prep, then probably about 1 to 2 minutes. If you're an unfortunate soul who has to debate somewhere where you only have 5 minutes of prep total, then you want to use less. But like 1 to 2 minutes, I think is a good estimate for the amount of 1AR prep time that you want to try and use. Huh?
Where is the rest of it? Then the 2AR. The 2AR is like 6 minutes.
Yep. Absolutely. Yeah. The 2AR should get like 6 minutes. And this is for 2 reasons. So one is it puts a lot of pressure on that 2N, right? How many of you as a 1A, or like you're a 1A, you're also a 2N, right? You rely on the 1AR using a bunch of prep. So you can prep your own speech too, right? That's part of your strategy. So if the 1AR takes it away from you, you're like, oh shit, what am I gonna do? Right, so it really puts a lot of pressure on that 2N if you as the 1A don't use a lot of 1AR. And you also want to give that time to your 2A because they have to get the last speech. Right, so aim for about 1 to 2 minutes. I think you should be prepping the 1AR throughout the debate. Right, so if you're really good at writing a bunch of 1AR blocks, the 1NC happens, and while the 2AC is prepping, or if they're reading something that you're like, oh, I know exactly what this is, you can pull your generic version of your 1AR blocks and put that in a file. So like before the 2AC even starts, you could have a generic version of your 1AR ready. Now, you obviously want to edit that so it can be more specific to what the negative's saying, right? So you should not do a stand-up 1AR, right? Stand-up 1ARs are bad. But you can, like most of the time, have the basic generic version of your 1AR done before the 2AC even starts. Especially if you're debating with someone who takes a lot of 2AC prep, which I don't know, I debated with someone who took a lot of 2AC prep. So it was like almost every debate, I was like, cool, like just got to listen to the block real quick and then I'll be good to go. So you can prep a lot of this before the 1AR's prep time clock starts. You should also prep your 1AR before the debate begins. Prep the 1AR before the debate begins, right? If you're debating a team who really likes going for this conditions counterplan, you're like, I think that's what they're going to go for in this debate, right? Start putting together your answers. If you got access to evidence they've read beforehand, read and indict those cards before the debate starts, because they're probably going to read the same cards. I'm a little bit hesitant to put this up here, but I'm going to anyways. I'll put a little asterisk next to it. This is like this is very much on the after awesome list, which is to say that once you're really good and know what you're doing, then you can start shadow flowing, which is our word for, instead of flowing what the other team is saying, you're writing your responses. So if they're like, extend 1 and C for no impact to economic decline, blah, 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 blah. Instead of flowing that, you'd be writing extend 2AC for yes, impact to econ decline, such and such and such. It's very difficult. And again, would not recommend if you do not feel incredibly comfortable with your ability to flow. But it is the kind of thing that will save time. So it's something to consider if you think that you're really good at flowing. Which, to be fair, given the state of modern debate, I'm going to guess that all of you need some help with flowing. Thank you for the honesty, Gio. In which case, you should not do that. So this is very much so like after you are perfect at flowing, something to consider. Okay, questions, comments, concerns? Okay, I'm happy to, oh, Callie, did you have a question? Okay, Victoria, right?
Yeah, so like what would you recommend using like the 1 hour private time to get like clarifications on the one that
I guess this kind of goes back to the we're all not great at flowing thing. You should be good enough at flowing that you don't need to do that, is really the answer. If you do need to do it, like, yeah, ask clarification questions. Yeah, flowing's great. People should flow more. I don't get it. Okay, other questions? Okay, I'm happy to hang out if y'all think of other cues. Yeah.
And if they concede an advantage, then just a quick overview on one time.
Yeah, then you would have a quick overview. But when you start to debate like the upper echelons of debate or peoples, that's not going to happen. They're just not going to concede an advantage. Or if they do concede an advantage, it'll be on purpose. Okay, have fun with the rest of your other elective today. Let me know if you all have other questions. Go forth, be amazing 1As. Strike fear in all of the 2 ends.